Hi everyone, this is Jim. I wanted to take a look at some games from the recently concluded Women's World Chess Championship. The two players contending for the championship were Mariya Muzychuk from the Ukraine, the current Women's World Champion. She won her championship, by the way, last year in a 64-player knockout tournament, and I covered that on this channel. And her opponent, Yifan, is the former women's world champion. So she was the women's world champion before Mariya won that knockout tournament. So a match was arranged between the two of them. It's a 10-game match, and it was played in the Ukraine. The first game I wanted to look at was game two. So Yifan has the white pieces here, and Mariya Muzychuk the black. Yifan starts off with e4. We get, after a few moves, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, the Ruy Lopez. And fortunately, for the interest of chess fans everywhere, we didn't get the boring line that you see so often in men's tournaments with knight f6, the Berlin defense, which can lead to a long end game where black struggles to maintain equality, although it seems like black can get a draw that way if he knows what he's doing. But we get the main line, the traditional way of playing the Ruy Lopez, a6, kicking the bishop back, also known as the Morphy defense, knight f6, castles. And now we get a deviation. The main line continues here with bishop e7, and this leads to what's known as a closed Ruy Lopez. Another interesting way to play, which I often play, is with b5 and bishop to c5. I call that the modern main line in my videos. But what Mariya plays here is knight takes e4, the open Ruy Lopez, and this leads to a very sharp and double-edged position. So it's the kind of position I can recommend, or the kind of opening I can recommend to black players if they're interested in trying to play for a win with the black pieces. They're not just trying to get equality, but get a sharp position where they have some winning chances. The main line continues here with d4. You can also play as white. You can play rook e1 and just get the pawn back immediately. But d4 is the better way to play, actually. And then if black tries to grab even more material by taking that pawn, it opens up this file against the king, and black can get into trouble pretty quickly. So black doesn't take that pawn, but first kicks the bishop back and plays d5. I just wanted to pause for a minute here and say, if you're interested in some of those sharper lines in the open Ruy Lopez, I actually cover them in my Chess Basics series, so you can find a video on the open Ruy Lopez there. Okay, but Mariya plays the main moves here, b5, kicking the bishop back, and then d5, supporting the knight, and just willing to give that pawn back. So black grabbed the e-pawn, but then gave up her own e-pawn in return. So the material is even. This pawn is under fire. The d-pawn is under fire from the queen and the bishop. So bishop to e6 is played here. And now we get an interesting point. This is kind of the starting point for the variation, main line of the open Ruy Lopez. And there's different moves that have been tried here. Originally c3 was the main line at this point. And black has some interesting ideas, some interesting attacking ideas with bishop to c5 here, coordinating with the knight on f2. And in fact, black will often take on f2, winning a rook and a pawn, but also this e-pawn is weak. So black will often get two pawns and a rook for the two pieces, and that leads to interesting play. So as a way of avoiding that, white players have been playing knight b to d2 first, and then c3 later. So that gives white the option of trading off this knight if the bishop comes out and eliminating this attack on the f2 pawn. But Yifan plays a third move here, also in the database, but not quite as popular as the other moves, but bishop e6, just protecting the f2 pawn and taking a look at this c5 square here so that no pieces are going to come out and put pressure on f2 here. So Mariya Muzychuk continues with bishop e7, We get c3 now. c3 is a very logical move. You can see I mentioned that was the main line to be played a move earlier. It does several things. It opens up the c2 square for the bishop, so the bishop can retreat. It exercises a little bit of influence over these squares d4 and b4, slowing down these pawns, restraining these pawns, and perhaps preparing to put a piece on d4 at some point. Right now, knight d4 would lose a pawn, so that's not happening right away, but that's potentially a square that white can use at some point. Okay, Mariya castles here. Knight bd2 and queen d7. So we get very normal moves. Now bishop to c2, putting pressure on the knight. And there are two ways for black to play this. The move f5 rather, to support the knight has been played here. But Mariya chooses the move knight takes d2, just getting rid of that liability. The knight did not have a lot of great squares to go back to. It always had, actually, there was always the option of retreating to c5, although I don't know if that would have worked in this case. But anyway, trading the knight off is not bad. Queen takes d2 and bishop to g4, putting a little pressure on this knight and actually threatening to win the e-pawn now. Bishop takes knight, and then knight takes e5 is a possibility here. And previously, in my opening book, the move queen to d3 had been played. There's a little tempo move, threatening checkmate there, and then presumably white finds a way to deal with the threat on the pawn after that. Yifan skips that move and just directly plays bishop to f4, defending the pawn. But this allows black to damage white's pawn structure, and so this is kind of an interesting decision. But black has to give up the bishop pair to do that. Anyway, Mariya Muzychuk goes for this line. Bishop takes f3, g takes f3. So the e-pawn is defended, the material is even. White's king is a little bit exposed along the g-file, perhaps, but white has the bishop pair and open lines and this pawn that's exerting maybe a bit of a cramping influence on black's position. So there's compensation for white in this position for the damage to the king side, and it appears there's no immediate threats to the king. So Mariya just continues building up in the center, securely defending the d-pawn and maybe preparing to attack the e-pawn here. And now Yifan plays this interesting move, rook f to d1. When I saw this rook to d1 move, I just naturally assumed that it was the other rook coming to d1. That's kind of the natural way to place these pieces. This rook here, you've got them centralized. And on the open files, when you bring this rook over, it blocks in the a8 rook. So how is this rook getting into the game? Well, it turns out that Yifan has an interesting plan for getting this a1 rook into the game, and also this rook f to d1 has created an escape square for the king in case there are attacks along the g-file. So an interesting move there, and not one that I would have thought of, but looks like a very good move. So queen to e6 was played here. Sorry, queen to e6, attacking the e-pawn, queen to e3, defending it, and now rook to d7. So this is the first move where black's position starts to go downhill a little bit. Up until this point, the position has been in the range of about even. So the trade-offs have been well balanced. You know, the damage to the pawn structure is compensated for by the bishop pair, but no more. It's not like black or white has an advantage here at this point. It's pretty even. The chess engine is suggesting the move bishop to h4 here. And this would prevent the maneuver in the game where Yifan dropped her bishop back to g3 and then pushed this pawn forward. After bishop to h4, if the bishop goes back to g3, then black can just trade off that bishop and grab the pawn. So a pretty simple idea here. So this bishop h4 move is an interesting move. It puts kind of a kink in white's plans. So rook to d7 is, it's preparing to double on the d file, maybe push the d pawn forward, but it appears it's not quite the most accurate move in the position. So now bishop to g3, as I hinted, we're getting to and g6. g6 is not a bad move. It is shutting down the light squared diagonal. There was always this threat of the queen hopping on this diagonal with a mate threat and gaining a tempo. And, with the potential, with a move like a4 of creating some weaknesses over here, you could turn that into a double attack. So Mariya has taken care of those possibilities in advance. And now the move a4 is played anyway. This move a4, in addition to creating weaknesses on the queen side, is aimed at liberating the rook. And that's the idea of leaving this rook on the a file. And we'll see how it plays an important role in a few moves. Now Mariya makes a second slight mistake. She drops this knight back to d8. Now this is a very understandable move. Basically in this position, black, looking at the pawn structure, sees this backward c-pawn, and this pawn really wants to come forward either to c6 to support the neighboring pawns, or maybe to c5 to participate in a queenside attack of some kind. So getting the knight out of the way is a logical move, but there are dangers on the open a file that turn up shortly, and so the chess engine is recommending just pushing the b pawn forward with b4. This keeps the a file closed. It does open up the c file. This gives white a chance to take and then maybe get a rook to the c file, but that attack is a little bit slower than what's happening on the a file. We'll see that things come pretty quickly after this. The knight retreats to d8. Yifan takes, take back, and then after that little opening of the queen side, goes back to the king side with f4. So some nice play on both wings. Always interesting to see that. And there is this threat of the pawn pushing right on to f5, supported by this bishop here, and that would open up some lines against black's king. So Mariya Muzychuk responds actively by pushing forward with this f-pawn. This also creates a space for the rook to come over and help defend the king side in some circumstances. But mainly it's just trying to get some activity going before white's attack progresses any further. Yifan takes, Mariya takes back, and then queen to e2. So this queen is being repositioned onto a light squared diagonal so it can hop out and participate in the king side attack. Now c6 is played. This is the idea of getting the knight out of the way to be able to bring this pawn over, and now black's pieces won't be so tied up defending the d pawn, or so you might think. But as you watch the rest of the game, you'll see that the d pawn is still a problem. But this, for the moment, has solved the problem of the defending the d pawn and freed up black's pieces to move. Okay, now the queen does come out to g4, which also hits the loose rook here. So the rook slides over to b7, and now f5 is pushed forward. Very direct and forceful play from Yifan. There's just this threat of opening up the king side here, and let's see. Black continues with bishop to d6. It's opening up the 7th rank here, so the rook can slide over and defend. So if pawn takes on g6, the rook can come over and pin the pawn. And also that's a good square for the rook opposite not only the queen but the king. And at the same time, it also threatens to trade out this bishop if the bishop becomes a danger. So rook to a6, though, is Yifan's reply. And now we start to see the pressure mounting along the 6th rank, and this d5 pawn becomes weak again because of the threat of pins along here. We'll see this happening shortly. Okay, this rook slides over to g7. That was the plan. Now f takes g6. And we've reached a critical juncture in the game. Black is a little bit worse here, but not yet losing. And there's various ways to play this. First of all, though, you can't take the pawn, and this is a really interesting line here. If you grab the pawn, then white really can take on d5. This is an exchange sacrifice. White gives up the rook and wins the bishop and drives the queen back. Queen goes to e7. So in this position, white has sacked the exchange, but white got a pawn for the exchange and has the bishop pair. So that's enough for material equality, basically. But on top of that, if you look at the position, you recognize that black's pawns are scattered and her king is exposed. So, a simple move like bishop to b3 here, putting the bishop on this good diagonal is going to win some more material and put the king in danger. So this is actually a winning position for white. Giving up the exchange and going for this is a good trade for white. So black can't afford to take that pawn right here. The line given by the chess engine, the way to survive this position is to first trade off this dark squared bishop, and then drop the queen back to e7 so as to unpin this pawn, and now the d pawn is defended. The king goes to f1 in this line, and that's interesting because the king wants to get away from potential threats here, although it's not an immediate problem. Notice that the bishop is guarding that pawn, so the rook can't take it. But it's interesting that the king is making use of that f1 square that was vacated by the rook when rook f to d1 was played. And now black takes with the pawn here, and we get a position where white is a little bit better, but the material is even, and black has a chance to hold this. So that would be best play. Instead, Mariya went for a trickier line, which looks good at first, but Yifan finds the best defense here. So bishop c5 allows white to grab the d pawn because of the pin, but grabbing the d pawn is a mistake here. If rook takes d5, then bishop takes f2 with check, and now the king has to move. Taking just invites the queen into f2. That would be a big mistake. So the king moves, and now bishop takes g3, and after bishop pawn takes, or probably queen takes to control f2, we get a position similar to what we looked at, where the material is going to be even. Black's going to get this pawn back, and the game will continue. So that was perhaps what Mariya had in mind when she played that bishop c5 move. So hoping for the immediate rook takes d5. But after bishop to c5, Yifan did not take that pawn immediately, but just played king to g2 to get rid of the check. Now it's safe for black to take this pawn here. It's no longer well, rook takes d5 can be played here, and is, but Yifan, Mariya Muzychuk grabbed the pawn on g6. Yifan grabbed on d5, and now she tries this bishop f2 move. Mariya does, and unfortunately, it doesn't work in this case because it's no longer with check. So white is not obliged to respond directly over here by taking the bishop or making any further moves. And there's another really good move that white has in this position, which is bishop to b3, setting up threats along this diagonal. This pawn takes d5 is still not on because of the pin on the c pawn. And so even though material is even in this position, it is just too dangerous for white to live here, or for black to live here. For example, if c takes d5 was played here, white can throw in bishop takes d5 check, and then after knight e6, blocking the check and also blocking the attack on the queen. If the king just moves, then rook takes queen. So knight e6 blocks the check, and it also blocks the path to the queen, but it loses a piece with rook takes e6. So this is just winning for white. So you can't try and wiggle out of things that way. Knight to e6 was played immediately, probably the best try in this position, but now rook to d6 pins that knight, and there's no defense for it. Mariya tried bringing the bishop back to c5, hitting the rook, and now queen takes e6 with check, and she resigns, because after queen takes, rook takes, black is just a piece down, and white is winning. So a very nice performance from Yifan, the former Women's World Champion. It gives her a 1.5 to 1/2 lead in the tournament after 2 games, after 2 rounds. And stay tuned. I'll be back for more coverage of this championship match. See you then. Bye.